The classroom fell silent as the teacher sneered, holding up the patch like contraband. "This doesn't belong here," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. The boy shrank in his seat, cheeks burning, unaware that 50 roaring Harleys were already preparing to rewrite the lesson the whole town would never forget. Before we start this story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Also, please subscribe to the channel. It will help us to bring you more inspiring stories every day. In the working-class town of Riverton Hill, 10-year-old Micah Graves clutched the small biker patch his late father had left him. It wasn't much, just a worn emblem stitched with faded thread. But to Micah, it was a treasure, a reminder of the man who once roared down highways with the Hells Angels. His father had passed in an accident 2 years earlier, and the patch was the only piece of him Micah carried daily. He wore it on his backpack, proud yet quiet. At school, though, not everyone understood. Some kids whispered, some mocked, and on a gray Monday morning, his teacher, Mrs. Carver, noticed it for the first time. She plucked it from his bag in front of the class, lips curling. "This is no place for biker nonsense," she snapped. Micah's throat closed, his hands trembling. The patch dangled from her fingers like something dirty. And in that moment, it felt like his father's memory was being mocked too. Micah tried to protest, his voice small. "It was my dad's. He gave it to me." But Mrs. Carver's tone was sharp, final. "Then it belongs at home, not here." She tossed it onto her desk like trash. The classroom buzzed with whispers, some kids snickering. Micah sank into his chair, cheeks burning hot. He didn't cry, not in front of them, but the ache in his chest was unbearable. At recess, he sat alone, staring at the ground while others played. Mr. Lawson, the janitor, noticed the boy's stillness and knelt beside him. "What's wrong, son?" Micah hesitated, then whispered, "She took my dad's patch. Said it doesn't belong." Lawson's face tightened. He'd seen Micah's father ride with the Angels years back, a man who never missed a Little League game. "That patch belongs wherever you carry it," Lawson said gently. That afternoon, as Micah trudged home, he didn't know his quiet hurt would soon roar across Riverton Hill like thunder. At home, Micah showed his mother, Renee, the patch now crumpled in his pocket. She hugged him tight, her voice soft. "Your father would have wanted you to be proud of it." Micah nodded, but his eyes brimmed. That evening, while tucking him into bed, Renee stepped onto the porch and made a phone call. The number rang once before a gravelly voice answered. "It's Renee Graves," she said. "It's about Micah." His teacher shamed him for wearing the patch. Silence on the line, then the low rumble of a chuckle. "She messed with the wrong kid," came the reply. The next morning, as Riverton Hill Elementary buzzed with routine, the faint growl of engines began in the distance. One bike, then 5, then 50. By the time the first bell rang, the street outside the school trembled like a storm rolling in. Children pressed to the windows as chrome glinted under the rising sun. 50 Harleys lined the curb, their riders dismounting in unison, leather vests heavy with patches. Teachers rushed to the doors, panic etched across their faces, but the men stood calm, arms folded, silent, but unshakable. Micah, walking toward the entrance with his backpack, froze when he saw them. His heart leapt. These weren't strangers. They were his father's brothers. One, a towering man named Jonah Brick Mercer, crouched to Micah's level. "You called, kid?" Micah shook his head, wide-eyed. "No. Mama did." Brick ruffled his hair, smiling. "Then we're here for both of you." Inside, Mrs. Carver's jaw dropped as the principal stepped outside, trying to keep order. What's the meaning of this? Brick's voice rolled like gravel. A boy was mocked for honoring his father. We came to make sure respect gets taught here too. The bikers didn't storm or shout, they simply walked Micah inside. A protective wall of leather and loyalty. Children stared in awe, whispers trailing down the hallway. Some clapped, others gasped, but Micah's shoulders straightened for the first time in months. At his classroom door, Brick paused, his gaze locking on Mrs. Carver. "This patch isn't just fabric," he said, his voice steady. "It's a memory, a legacy. You don't strip that from a kid." Mrs. Carver flushed crimson, stammering. The principal cleared his throat, uneasy. "Perhaps we can reconsider how personal items are handled." Micah walked to his desk, the patch stitched proudly back onto his backpack by one of the angels that morning. As he sat down, classmates who once laughed now looked at him differently. For the first time, Micah didn't feel small. He felt like he carried 50 uncles at his back, and the world knew it. Whispers rippled through Riverton Hill by lunchtime. Parents texted one another, rumors spreading faster than wildfire. 50 Hell's Angels at the school. Some were alarmed, others intrigued. The principal held an emergency meeting, trying to calm staff. "They didn't make threats," he admitted reluctantly. "They escorted a boy to class." Mrs. Carver sat rigid, her lips thin as knives. "This undermines authority. He brought gang symbols into school." She hissed. But another teacher spoke up softly. "It wasn't a symbol. It was his father's memory." Outside, the bikers waited in silence, leaning on their bikes, drinking coffee handed to them by curious townsfolk. Brick's calm presence kept tensions low. "We're not here to scare kids," he explained to one reporter. "We're here to show them family matters." By day's end, even skeptics admitted order hadn't broken. If anything, respect lingered heavier than fear. And Micah, walking home, wore his patch proudly for the first time. That evening, Renee's porch became the town's unexpected gathering spot. Neighbors drifted over with casseroles, pie tins, and questions. Some thanked the bikers, others voiced unease. Brick stood on the steps, his deep voice cutting through chatter. "We don't want trouble. We want a kid to grow up knowing his father mattered." His words carried weight. Renee glanced at Micah, who clutched his patch like a medal. A woman from across the street wiped tears from her cheeks. "I was raised by my grandma. Sometimes all I needed was someone to remind me I wasn't forgotten." Slowly, heads nodded. Darius, a younger angel, added, "This ain't about reputation, it's about loyalty. That boy has 50 uncles now. That's something no bully or insult can take away." By nightfall, tension had melted into acceptance. For the first time in years, Riverton Hill felt like a town standing shoulder to shoulder. But Mrs. Carver wasn't done. The next morning, she stormed into the principal's office with a folder of complaints. "They intimidated staff. They endangered students," she declared. The principal rubbed his temples. No one was harmed. No rules were broken. Parents are divided, but most support what happened. Carver's face flushed. "So we're just letting bikers run this school?" She snapped. Meanwhile, in the hallway, Micah stood straighter, classmates flocking to him with new respect. "Was that really your dad's crew?" One boy whispered in awe. Micah nodded. "They said they'll always have my back." For the first time, laughter around him wasn't at his expense, it was shared. On the playground, he joined a game of baseball, his father's memory no longer a secret shame, but a badge of honor. And though Mrs. Carver seethed, Micah finally understood. Power wasn't in silencing someone's story, it was in daring to carry it proudly. That weekend, the Angels invited Micah and Renee to the old Ironwood Fairgrounds, where they gathered for a community cookout. Rows of bikes gleamed under the summer sun, grills smoked, and laughter echoed. Micah sat high on a Harley, Brick's massive hand steadying him as he grinned ear to ear. Renee, at first nervous, softened as she saw her son surrounded not by outlaws, but by protectors, uncles who taught him how to grip handlebars, toss a baseball, even fix a flat tire. At dusk, the group formed a circle, raising their cups. Brick spoke quietly. "This boy carries his father's light. Our job is to make sure it never dims." Micah's throat tightened. For the first time since losing his dad, he felt whole again. As the engines roared into the night, Renee realized the Angels hadn't filled the absence of one. Man, they had multiplied it into a brotherhood. Of the Angels' stand reached beyond Riverton Hill. Local. Papers ran the story under headlines like, "Bikers defend boy's right to honor father." Radio callers debated fiercely, but most spoke with admiration. One veteran said, "That patch is a memorial. They did right by him." Even families who once crossed the street to avoid bikers now waved when they rode past. At school, Micah walked taller. Mrs. Carver avoided his gaze, but others smiled warmly. During art class, he drew a picture of 50 bikes lined like guardians, his father's patch at the center. When he showed Renee that evening, she kissed his forehead. "Your dad would be proud," she whispered. Micah smiled softly. "I think he already knows." And for the first time in a long while, the boy who once felt invisible carried himself as though the whole world finally saw him. By Monday, the school board had convened to review the incident. Parents filled the small chamber, some fearful, most supportive. Renee sat in the front row, her hand resting on Micah's shoulder. Mrs. Carver stood stiffly, her voice sharp. "This is unacceptable. Allowing gang symbols in class sets a dangerous precedent." Murmurs rose in protest until a father from the back stood. "That patch isn't a gang symbol, it's a memorial to his dad. You can't erase love because you're uncomfortable." The board shifted uneasily, clearly torn. Then a teacher, once silent, added, "I've taught Micah. That patch makes him braver, not disruptive." Carver flushed red. The final decision was read aloud. Micah could keep the patch. The room erupted in applause. For the first time, the boy looked at his mother with shining eyes, realizing his story had just been defended publicly. That afternoon, the Angels gathered outside the board office, waiting quietly. When Micah emerged with Renee, applause thundered from the line of bikes. Brick stepped forward, dropping to one knee so he was eye level with the boy. "They can't take what's yours, kid," he said, fastening the patch firmly onto Micah's backpack. "You carry it with pride because it carries your dad." Cameras flashed, reporters jotted notes, but Micah barely noticed. All he saw were 50 uncles, their vests heavy with history, standing behind him like an iron wall. Renee's throat tightened, overwhelmed by the sight. The roar of engines followed as the Angels departed in formation, not in anger, but in celebration. To the townsfolk who lined the sidewalks, it was no longer a story of intimidation. It was a parade of remembrance. Mrs. Carver, however, didn't fade quietly. In the teacher's lounge, she muttered about losing control. "This isn't how schools should run." But colleagues began to distance themselves, weary of her bitterness. One younger teacher whispered, "Maybe control isn't what he needed. Maybe he needed compassion." At recess, Micah noticed he wasn't alone anymore. Classmates invited him into games, no longer mocking but eager to stand near the boy with 50 protectors. On the baseball field, he swung harder, laughed louder, his father's spirit alive in every movement. Renee, watching from the stands, felt her heart mend. For the first time since the accident, Micah wasn't living in shadow, he was stepping boldly into light. And though Mrs. Carver's glare still lingered, her power over him had vanished, drowned out by the rumble of loyalty that had claimed his corner. The angels didn't disappear after their stand. Every Friday, one or two would ride by the school, not loud or disruptive, just present. Kids pressed against the fence, waving. Teachers looked on, some wary, others smiling. Micah beamed each time, his confidence building brick by brick. One afternoon, the angels parked at the playground and handed out ice cream bars, their laughter mixing with children's squeals. Parents came to thank them, offering handshakes and casseroles. For Riverton Hill, the once feared bikers had become guardians of community spirit. That evening, Brick told Renee, "Your boy's more than safe, he's a symbol now." And symbols change towns. Renee nodded, tears in her eyes, realizing the ripple of Micah's patch had spread farther than she ever dreamed out by summer's end. The angels organized a charity ride in Micah's father's name. Hundreds of bikes roared across county highways, chrome gleaming under the sun. A banner read, "Ride for Legacy in memory of Aaron Graves." Renee and Micah led the convoy in a pickup, waving as people lined the streets, cheering. Micah's chest swelled with pride, his father's patch stitched firmly to his vest now. At the fairgrounds afterward, Brick lifted Micah onto a Harley, revving the engine gently. "Someday you'll ride too. But for now, just know you're never riding alone." The boy grinned, the sound filling his soul like music. Renee, clutching a lemonade, whispered to herself, "He has 50 fathers now." And in that moment, she knew her son's future wasn't defined by loss, but by brotherhood. The charity ride sparked something new in Riverton Hill. Local papers called Micah the boy with 50 uncles, and his story spread across counties. Letters poured into Renee's mailbox, veterans, single parents, widows, all saying Micah's courage reminded them of their own strength. At school, his patch was no longer mocked. It was admired. Kids leaned in during show and tell as he explained its history, his small voice steady now. Mrs. Carver sat stiff in the corner, forced to listen. For Micah, it wasn't revenge, it was vindication. He no longer felt invisible. He carried his father's memory openly, without shame. That evening, Renee tucked him into bed, brushing his hair back. "You've changed things, Micah," she whispered. The boy blinked sleepily. "I didn't. Dad did. And my uncles." Outside, faint but steady, the sound of a Harley echoed like a lullaby, reminding them both they weren't alone. As autumn rolled in, the angels presented Micah with something extraordinary. At a small ceremony behind the community center, Brick handed him a miniature leather vest. Stitched across the back was a single word, "Honorary." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Micah's hands shook as he slipped it on, the patch shining under golden leaves. "This doesn't mean you ride with us yet," Brick said, smiling. "It means you're family, always." Tears filled Renee's eyes as she snapped a photo, knowing this moment would live forever in their hearts. The townsfolk clapped, some wiping their eyes. Even skeptics who once muttered about intimidation now admitted they'd never seen loyalty so pure. Micah stood taller, his father's memory stitched into his back. No longer just a boy with a keepsake, but a boy with a legacy. Mrs. Carver resigned quietly that winter. The official reason was personal matters, but everyone in town knew the truth. She could not stand against a tide of compassion that proved her wrong. The new teacher, Mr. Landry, encouraged Micah's pride, even asking him to share stories about his dad during history lessons. Micah spoke softly but with conviction, explaining that strength wasn't about being the loudest. It was about standing for something. His classmates listened with rapt attention, and for the first time, Micah became a leader among them. Renee watched her son transform with awe. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. And though the absence of Aaron Graves would always ache, she realized his spirit lived louder now than it ever had. The roar of Harleys had carried his memory into the future, wrapped in brotherhood and bound by love. The following spring, Riverton Hill held its first legacy parade. Families decorated floats, children waved flags, and at the center rode 50 bikers, engines thundering like drums of honor. Micah rode with Brick at the front, his honorary vest shining in the sun. As the parade wound through town, cheers erupted. Parents lifted kids onto shoulders, elders clapped, and Renee walked proudly beside the bikes, tears streaking her cheeks. Reporters captured the scene, publishing it under headlines like, "From Mockery to Legacy, How a Boy United a Town." That night, as the angels feasted around bonfires, Micah sat between them, his laughter blending with their stories. He realized then that the patch wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about everyone who chose to carry love louder than judgment. Years later, Riverton Hill would still tell the story of the boy with the patch. Micah grew into a young man, his father's spirit stitched into everything he did. The honorary vest hung in his room, a constant reminder that he was never truly alone. On quiet nights, Renee still heard the distant hum of engines as the angels passed through, a silent promise that loyalty never fades. Standing at his window one evening, Micah whispered, "Thanks, Dad. Thanks, uncles." The wind carried the sound, mingling with the faint thunder of Harleys. What began as a moment of humiliation had become a legend of protection, love, and family. And in Riverton Hill, one truth rang clear. No child should ever be shamed for honoring where they come from, especially when 50 engines are ready to roar in their defense. From shame to strength. Micah's story shows that loyalty echoes louder than judgment. If this tale touched you, subscribe, like, and tap the bell so more stories of resilience, family, and unexpected brotherhood ride straight into your heart.